Good evening. It is my special privilege to welcome you to the 10th Boyle Lecture of the Modern Series. And in doing so, I must first of all announce that very sadly, John Polkinghorne, a trustee of the series and this year's lecturer, is prevented by illness from being with us tonight. And his paper will be delivered by Professor John Hedley Brooke. Dr. Polkinghorne is very sorry for this indeed. He would at least have loved to have sat among us, but it was plainly inadvisable for him to travel at the moment. I hope, however, that it will not mute our celebrations, which are perhaps manifold. Today, transferred out of Holy Week, is the feast of the Annunciation and the feast of title of this ancient place. We're also celebrating the 10th anniversary of this initiative, and with it the publication of all the recent lectures, a handsome volume, ably edited, and which I commend. These are considerable achievements, which we are very delighted to mark with you. In that context, it falls happily to me to express on behalf of my fellow trustees a special gratitude to Dr. Michael Byrne, the initiator and animator of the project, whose generosity, judgment and good sense have been a model for a collaborator and a convener. Quite simply, he is a joy to work with, and my own debt and that of the parish to him is immense. He has nursed the lectures to a maturity which has matched originality with academic distinction. We are second up on Google. When I was first an undergraduate and immersed in the absurd rivalries of religion as it grips students, some would say that I still am, one name was breathed by all with reverence: John Polkinghorne, a scientist of international reputation, an apologist and later a priest, and in due course the head of a college. Tonight's lecture is intended in good part to celebrate his considerable achievements and the gratitude of the Church of England for all he is for us. A fine priest and the nicest of men. His absence is poignant, but our gratitude no less felt. And we also owe thanks to our principal partners, Gresham College, which has consistently supported the lectures as this year's and given us an honoured place in its own programme and website. You will find this year's proceedings there and on our own website in due course. The worshipful company of Mercers, whose premises are close by and whose history is contiguous with our own, have repeatedly shown their appreciation for this project and over time will share a greater part. And the worshipful company of Grocers, who from time to time have the right to nominate the rector of the parish and are the firmest friends we could have, and are unstintingly thoughtful and generous, and we owe to the master, clerk and their staff the warmest possible thanks. To introduce the lecture, I'm delighted to hand over to our convener, Dr. Michael Byrne.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me join with George in welcoming you here this evening. Our friends, as he has said, at Gresham College, who've provided invaluable support for this lecture series over the last 10 years, made video recordings of many of the early lectures, and that practice has been continued by St. Paul's Institute in recent years. All of these clips, including those from the Institute, have been uploaded onto Gresham College's website and are available for viewing there. I'd like to say that this library of images has created an invaluable resource for further reflection on the rich content of these lectures. But actually, and much less honourably, what it has actually created is an invaluable resource so that George Bush and I can check on how comprehensively we've each aged in the decade since these lectures began. The first Boyle Lecture in this new series took place at this church in 2004, a mere 312 years since the first Boyle Lecture in the old series took place at St. Martin in the Fields. In those days, a lecturer had to deliver, and an audience had to sit through, 8 lectures each year, 4 in the spring and 4 in the autumn. And they were given as sermons, as most, if not all, of the early lecturers were clergymen. These days they may still feel like sermons, but we do provide the text in written form for you to take away and reread at your leisure, as we'll do again this evening. As George has explained, our lecturer tonight was due to have been John Polkinghorne. John is sadly unwell and unable to be with us. With characteristic energy and organization, however, he had prepared the text of his lecture over a year ago. So we are fortunate to have John with us very much in spirit this evening, if not in person. I should, I suppose, acknowledge that some of the Boyle lectures have strained the brain from time to time, an inevitable consequence of attempting to engage with not just one but 2 difficult subject matters, science and theology, at a high level and at the same time. What we're attempting to do in these lectures is to ask what science and theology might have to learn from one another, and how their differing approaches to asking deep questions about reality might complement one another. Those of you who found previous lectures tough going can relax. John Polkinghorne's lecture is a model of clarity and good sense, which refers back to all the previous lectures since 2004 and brings them together into a very wide-ranging reflection on his theme. We send John our very best wishes for a speedy recovery. Before introducing this evening's speaker, I have 2 brief sales pitches to make. First, as George has mentioned, my colleague Russell Manning and I laboured long and hard over the last 18 months to collect all 10 of these lectures into a very handsome volume published by SEM Press, complete with a historical introduction by myself and a theological introduction by Russell. Copies of the book are on sale this evening at the stall at the side entrance of the church. Please do consider buying a copy. It's not that we need the money, but the thought of all that editorial effort going unrecognised is just too much to bear. Second, the booklet to be given out at the end of the lecture this evening advertises a splendid excuse for you to spend a few days in Ireland this July at the Robert Boyle Summer School, which will be held in Lismore, County Waterford. This is where Robert Boyle was born, in the wholly unmodest surroundings of Lismore Castle, now the Duke of Devonshire's bolt hole across the water. Details are in the booklet, so please do have a look. Russell and I may not need the money from our book, but Ireland certainly needs every tourist dollar it can find these days. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor John Hedley Brooke, who's kindly agreed to stand in for John Polkinghorne and read John's text. Déjà vu abounds in this arrangement, in that John Hedley Brooke gave his own Boyle lecture in 2009, which was a model of clarity and received with great enthusiasm. A former professor of the history of science and religion at Oxford, John has written widely in this area and is one of our most celebrated academic authors in the territory within which these Boyle lectures plough their furrow. Once John has finished speaking in the persona of John Polkinghorne, a vote of thanks will be proposed to both of them by one of our most enthusiastic and supportive trustees, Dr. Richard Charters, Bishop of London. In the meantime, I'm delighted to welcome you back to this event and to ask John Hedley Brooke to deliver John Polkinghorne's lecture.
Good evening. The title of John's lecture is Science and Religion in Dialogue. The key to understanding the relationship between science and religion lies in the recognition that both are, in their own specific ways, concerned with the search for truth, a truth that is attainable through commitment to well-motivated beliefs. The new atheists fail to acknowledge this fact, polemically alleging that religious people believe without evidence, or even against the evidence. This false caricature results in the new atheists paying no honest attention to serious theological discussion. Their writings are full of assertion, but lacking in engaged rational argument. Of course, in their search for truth, science and religion are exploring contrasting dimensions of the human encounter with reality. Science is concerned with impersonal encounter, reality treatable as an it, you might say. This is a realm in which experience can be manipulated and repeated as often as is desired. It is this which gives science its great secret weapon of experimental testing. If you don't believe that the pressure and volume of a given quantity of gas at constant temperature are inversely proportional, just investigate it for yourself, and you'll find out that Robert Boyle was right. Yet we all know that there is a different dimension of reality, the personal and transpersonal, where reality is encountered not as an it, but as a thou. And in that realm, testing has to give way to trusting. If I'm always setting little traps to see if you are my friend, I shall soon destroy the possibility of friendship between us. The attempt to manipulate God and put God to the test is the sinful error of magic. It's in this rich and profound realm of personal and transpersonal experience that religion pursues its quest for truth. In consequence, its questions are not those of science. The latter is concerned with the processes by which things happen, and it has achieved its great success by the modesty of its ambition, bracketing out from its consideration issues of meaning, value, and purpose. These latter questions, whether there's something going on in what is happening, are central to the concerns of religion. We know, in fact, that we have to ask both sorts of questions if we're to understand the world adequately. The kettle is boiling because burning gas heats the water. The kettle is boiling because I want to make a cup of tea. Both statements are true and are necessary to a full understanding of the event of the boiling kettle. The difference between the how questions of science and the why questions of religion might at first sight seem to suggest that the two are so distinct that they have no real connection with each other. Stephen Jay Gould took this view and referred to non-overlapping magisteria. However, this is not true, because though the questions are different, their answers have to be consonant with each other. Putting the kettle in the refrigerator is not compatible with wanting to make a cup of tea. Consequently, science and religion interact and complement each other. The conversation between them has in fact had a very long history. Science and religion are friends and not foes in the great quest for truthful understanding. They have things to tell each other. In fact, a fruitful dialogue is currently taking place between the two. The 10th anniversary of the revived Boyle Lectures offers an opportunity to review the present state of this conversation. I want to take us on an excursion along the busy frontier between science and religion, starting in my home territory, the end where the physicists dwell. They are deeply impressed by the wonderful order of the universe, revealed to us through its remarkable rational transparency to our inquiry. Of course, it's not surprising that we can understand the everyday world in which we have to be able to survive. Evolution will surely have shaped our brains to that end. But why are we able also to understand the hidden subatomic world of quantum physics, remote from direct impact upon us? That world is quite different in its character from the Newtonian world of every day. The latter is clear and regular in its character, but the quantum world is cloudy and fitful. In it, if you know where an electron is, you cannot know what it's doing. If you know what it's doing, you can't know where it is. That's Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in a nutshell. Yet we can understand that world on its own terms, and it turns out that the key to this understanding is the seemingly abstract subject of mathematics. It is a technique of discovery in fundamental physics, to seek theories that are expressed in equations that mathematicians can recognize as beautiful. Not all of you may know about mathematical beauty. It is a rather rarefied form of aesthetic experience, concerned with qualities such as elegance and economy. But it is something that the mathematically minded can agree about. Time and again in the history of physics, it has turned out that it is only such theories having the power of long-term explanation which persuade us of their validity. The greatest physicist that I've known personally was Paul Dirac, one of the founders of modern quantum theory. Asked once about his fundamental beliefs, he strode to a blackboard and wrote, "The laws of physics are expressed in beautiful equations." He made his great discoveries by a lifelong devotion to that belief. The rational transparency and rational beauty of the universe are facts that scientists are happy to exploit, but which science itself does not explain. Yet these are surely remarkable facts that it would be intellectually lazy just to treat as fortunate accidents. Theology can make the deep intelligibility of the universe itself intelligible when it sees cosmic order as a reflection of the mind of its creator. I believe that science is possible in the deep way that it has proved to be, just because the world is a divine creation, and we are, to use an ancient and powerful phrase, made in the image of our Creator. This insight is an illustration of the right relationship between science and theology. Religion should not pretend to be able to answer science's questions for it, for we've every reason to believe that scientifically statable questions will receive scientifically statable answers. But religion's role is to address questions that arise out of scientific experience, but which go beyond science's self-limited powers to address. The learned call these questions meta-questions. Such questions are deep, and it can't be claimed that the answers proposed are logically certain beyond demur. Rather, the claim must be that they are insightful and intellectually satisfying. It is not being asserted that atheists are stupid, for many are highly intelligent and truth-seeking people. But what is being asserted is that theism explains more than atheism can. This kind of reasoning is called natural theology, appealing to aspects of general experience, such as the character of the world that science explores, which are claimed to be best understood as offering hints of the veiled presence of God. Belief in the possibility of a natural theology of this kind has been a key theme in the Boyle Lectures. A second meta-question relevant to natural theology asks, why is the universe so special? On the whole, scientists prefer the general to the particular, and their natural expectation was that our world is just a common or garden specimen of what a universe might be like. However, as we've come to understand many of the processes that over 13.7 billion years have turned the almost uniform ball of energy that sprang from the Big Bang into the present world, we've come to realize that it's only a very particular one might say finely tuned universe that is capable of the astonishingly fruitful process of generating carbon-based life. This surprising and unexpected conclusion is often called the anthropic principle, and many considerations have led to it. John Barrow's Boyle Lecture summarized many of them. Here, one example will have to suffice. The very early universe is so simple that it only makes the two simplest chemical elements, hydrogen and helium. There's only one place in the universe where the vital element carbon, essential for life, can be made, and that is in the interior nuclear furnaces of the stars. Every atom of carbon in our bodies was once inside a star. We are the people of stardust. One of the triumphs of astrophysics in the 20th century was the unraveling of the processes by which the heavier elements were made. And it turns out that the generation of carbon depends very delicately on the detail of the nuclear forces involved. If these had been only a little bit different from what they are, there would have been no carbon, and we would not be here. Again, it would surely be intellectually lazy to treat this fine-tuning of the laws of nature, which science accepts but does not explain, as just a happy accident. The theist will see it as an expression of the Creator's will in bringing into being a creation endowed with great potentiality. Those who resist theism are driven to the somewhat desperate expedient of the hypothesis of the multiverse, the supposition that there exists a vast, possibly infinite array of different universes, each with different laws of nature, and all of them, apart from our own, inaccessible to us. In this vast collection, ours is just by chance the one capable of being anthropically fertile. Because of the lack of the possibility of direct observation, the prodigal assumption of the existence of a multiverse is as metaphysical as the assumption of the existence of a divine creator. And it does not have the kind of collateral support that considerations such as cosmic intelligibility afford to the concept of creation. Moreover, without further argument, it's by no means clear that even an infinite multiverse must include an anthropic member. An infinite array does not necessarily include every possibility. After all, there are an infinite number of even integers, but none of them has the property of oddness. Physicists are deeply impressed by the wonderful order of the cosmos and by the profound potentiality already present in the fabric of the laws of nature immediately following the Big Bang, which has enabled the universe, after 10 billion years of unfolding development, to generate life. Many physicists, even if they're not conventional religious believers, feel a kind of cosmic religiosity, such as Einstein expressed when he said that in making his great discoveries, he felt like a child in the presence of the elders. However, when we move to the biological sector of the frontier, the scene changes, and there is a great deal of border warfare. Partly, this is due to the unwise way in which some religious believers have mistakenly refused to accept the insights of evolutionary biology. But it's also due to the fact that the biologists see a much more complex and ambiguous scene than the physicist's view of deep cosmic order. Biological evolution is certainly fertile, but at the cost of predation, parasitism, and extinctions. The Boyle Lectures of Celia Dean Drummond, John Hort, Simon Conway Morris, and Keith Ward addressed these issues from a variety of perspectives. The basic theological way to think about evolution was neatly formulated by Charles Darwin's clergyman friend, Charles Kingsley, soon after the publication of The Origin of Species. He said that Darwin had made it clear that God had not created a ready-made world, but had done something cleverer than that in bringing into being a world so endowed with fruitful potentiality that creatures could be allowed to make themselves by their unfolding exploration of a divinely given fertility. From the theological understanding that the Creator is the God of love, such a creation in which creatures are given the freedom to be themselves and to make themselves is truly fitting, since the gift of love is always the gift of some appropriate measure of freedom afforded to the objects of love. An evolving creation is therefore a great good, but it has a necessary shadow side. It is a fundamental scientific insight that regimes which are capable of generating true novelty always exist at the edge of chaos. That is to say, they are regimes in which order and disorder, regularity and contingency, necessity and chance interlace. If things are too orderly, they're too rigid for anything really new to emerge. If there were no genetic mutations, no new forms of life could appear. Yet if things are too disorderly, nothing of novelty that emerged could persist. If there was too much genetic mutation, no species could become established on which the sifting and preserving process of natural selection could act. The fruitfulness of the 3.5 billion year history of life, which has turned what was originally a world of bacteria into a world with elephants and human beings, has depended on there being just the right amount of genetic mutation to be the engine of fertility. Yet if germ cells are to mutate and produce new forms of life, it is inevitable that body cells will also be able to mutate, and sometimes this will result in malignancy. The anguishing fact of cancer is not something gratuitous which a creator who was a bit more competent or a bit less callous could easily have eliminated. It is the necessary cost of a creation in which creatures are allowed to make themselves. Ironically, biological evolution is not the point of irreconcilable confrontation between science and religion, but it is where theology receives some help from science as it wrestles with what is surely its most challenging perplexity: the existence of natural evil and suffering in a world claimed to be the creation of a good and powerful God. We all tend to feel that if we had been in charge of creation, frankly, we would have done it better. We would have kept all the nice things, flowers and sunsets, and got rid of the nasties, disease and disaster. However, as science has shown us how the world actually has to work, we've come to see that it's a kind of package deal in which good and bad are inextricably intertwined as fruitfulness comes to birth at the edge of chaos. I do not suggest for a moment that this removes all the perplexity and anguish that we feel about evil and suffering. But I think these insights are of some help as theologians continue to struggle with these issues. Evolutionary process is not restricted to biology alone. Its general character is the interplay of regularity and contingency. For an example from physics, consider the history of the generation of cosmic structure. The very early universe, following the Big Bang, was not completely uniform, but there were small random fluctuations in its energy density. That's the contingency. Through the contractive influence of gravity, that's the regularity, these inhomogeneities were progressively enhanced, resulting in a snowball effect, which over about 1 billion years led to the vital emergence of stars and galaxies. The universe itself is fundamentally an evolving world. In relation to biology, the question naturally arises as whether the role of contingency does not imply that the eventual emergence of self-conscious beings in the history of life is no more than a fortunate but ultimately meaningless accident. Stephen Jay Gould notoriously claimed that if the tape of life were to be rerun a second time, so to speak, nothing remotely like ourselves could be expected to result. Certainly, Homo sapiens, in all our five-fingered specificity, would not be expected a second time. But Simon Conway Morris has argued that self-conscious beings of some kind would be a natural expectation. He points to the phenomenon of convergence in biological evolution, suggesting that the history of life is not some kind of random drunkard's walk through an infinite possibility space, never likely to be in anything like the same direction twice, but something much more constrained. The number of systems that are both biologically accessible and functionally effective seems to be quite limited. In consequence, there's a notable degree of repetition in evolutionary process. For example, the eye has evolved independently several times in the course of terrestrial history. The symphony of life is neither like the performance of a fixed score, predetermined in eternity, nor like random noise, but like a grand improvisation with the strikingly fruitful harmony in its contingent variations, taking place within the laws of biological counterpoint. This view of unfolding fertility has encouraged theologians to add to the venerable concept of creation out of nothing, that is, the timeless holding of the world in being by an eternal creator, the further concept of continuous creation, the unfolding within time of the Creator's will, realized within the divinely ordained processes of nature. The balance between creaturely action and divine providential action is one to which I shall return shortly. We now move to the final sector of the frontier, the place where theology's neighbours are the human sciences, such as psychology and anthropology. The Boyle Lectures of Philip Clayton and Malcolm Jeeves surveyed this territory. It's clearly one of great significance for theology, but I think that a great deal of exploration still remains to be done. Our attention will be directed briefly to what can be learned about the nature of the human person. Neuroscience is currently making great progress in identifying the neural pathways by which our brains process the information coming to us from our external environment. This work is surely significant, but I believe it's also necessary to be aware of its limited scope. It is clear that we are intrinsically embodied beings, and our conscious experience is closely linked to the physical state of our brains. A smart tap on the head with a hammer would be a crude way of making the same point. Yet there is a great gap yawning between talk of neural firings and the simplest mental experiences, such as seeing red or feeling toothache. This is a gap that no one currently knows how to bridge. The problem of qualia is a very hard problem indeed, which we're far from being able to solve. Bombastic talk of consciousness being the last frontier that the heroic armies of reductionist science are just about to cross is extremely ill-judged. In fact, it's just possible that the nature of consciousness is one that will never be amenable to full understanding in scientific terms alone. Everything else that science studies, whether matter or life, can be treated as external to us, but consciousness is internal and private. We have no direct access to the consciousness of another person. We know that we can agree about attaching the label red to the same object, but I do not know whether your experience of seeing red is exactly the same as mine. Science has certainly not established that mental experience is nothing but the firing of hordes of neurons, though it is certainly related to physical activity in the brain. Human beings are psychosomatic unities in which the mental and material exist in some kind of profound complementarity. Such a view of human nature would not have surprised the writers of the Bible, for in Hebrew thought, persons were seen, in a celebrated phrase, as animated bodies rather than incarnated souls. Although Christian thinking has often tended to be Platonic in character, regarding the soul as a kind of detachable spiritual component, temporarily housed in a fleshy body, awaiting release at death, this devaluation of our embodied status was a bad mistake. Human beings are not apprentice angels, and our ultimate hope is not spiritual survival, but the resurrection of the body. Must we then give up the idea of the soul? I do not think so, but we shall have to reconceive it. The soul is presumably the real me, the carrier of my personal identity. At first sight, it's almost as perplexing to know what this is in this present life as it might be beyond death. What makes me a bald, elderly academic the same person as the schoolboy with the shock of black hair in the photograph of long ago? It might seem that the answer is material continuity. But that is an illusion. The atoms that make up our bodies are changing all the time through wear and tear, eating and drinking. I am atomically distinct from that schoolboy. The real me, and here the problem is so deep that I admittedly have to wave my hands, but I believe in the right direction, is something like the almost infinitely complex information-bearing pattern, memories, character, etc., carried at one time by the atoms of my body. That pattern is the soul. In a very crude analogy, it is software rather than the hardware. I shall return to this point in a moment. So far, in a perambulation of the frontier, most of what I have said would be as consistent with the spectator god of deism, who simply decreed the order of the world and then stood back to see what happened as a result, as with the god of Christian theism, who is providentially active. But doesn't science portray a world so deterministic in its character that there's no scope for such specific divine action? Certainly, after Newton, many people believed the universe to be purely mechanical, a clockwork world whose god could be no more than a celestial clockmaker. In consequence, the 18th century saw the rise of deism. Yet the 20th century has seen the death of a merely mechanical picture of the physical universe. This was due to the discovery of intrinsic unpredictabilities present in nature, first at the subatomic level of quantum theory, and later at the macroscopic level of chaos theory. The word intrinsic is important here, for these are not unpredictabilities which could be removed by more precise calculation or more exact measurement. They are properties of nature. Unpredictability is an epistemological property concerned with what can or cannot be known. How epistemology relates to ontology, that is, what is the case, requires further metaphysical decision. For example, it's been found that the uncertainty in quantum physics can be interpreted either as due to an intrinsic indeterminacy present in nature, or it could be due simply to a necessary ignorance of some of the factors that fully determine what happens. It has turned out that there are theories of either kind which give exactly the same empirical results, despite their very different character. The choice between them, therefore, cannot be made on purely scientific grounds, but is a matter for metaphysical decision, which has to be defended by metaphysical arguments. Those of a realist turn of mind who think that what we know is a reliable guide to what is the case will closely align epistemology and ontology, and so interpret unpredictabilities as signs of an actual causal openness. To do so does not imply that the future is some sort of random lottery, but that there is space for the operation of other causal factors beyond science's reductionist account of the exchange of energy between constituents. An obvious candidate for such causes would be the willed acts of agents, either the whole human person or God's providential action within the open grain of creation. In any case, it's clear that science has not established the causal closure of the world on its reductionist terms alone. If something like this is right, it has three significant implications for theology. The first is that events cannot be exhaustively analysed and itemised, as if nature did this, human agency did that, and divine providence did a third thing. Details of causes are inevitably partially hidden behind a veil of unpredictability. The eye of faith may discern God's providence at work, but this can't be demonstrated explicitly. The second point to emphasize is that while there are these unpredictabilities in nature, think of the clouds, there are also reliable predictabilities. The sun will rise tomorrow at the expected time. In consequence, there are some things that it is not appropriate to pray for. The great early Christian thinker Origen, who lived in Alexandria, said that one should not pray for the cool of spring in the heat of summer, tempting though that must have been to him at times. I'm tempted to add, we would not be praying for it ourselves, given. But this is John's lecture. The third point is to emphasize that this picture of providence portrays God as acting within the unfolding open grain of nature and not fitfully interfering with it from the outside. Christian theology has to steer a course between two unacceptably extreme pictures of divine action. The one, the cosmic tyrant, in tight control of absolutely everything, giving no freedom at all to creatures. The other, the indifferent, deistic spectator. How the balance is actually struck between divine and creaturely action is the classic problem of grace and free will, now written cosmically large. A final issue has now to be faced. It is the significance of the future, an issue that Jürgen Moltmann addressed theologically in his Boyle Lecture. Every story that science has to tell ends ultimately in decay and futility. This is due to the second law of thermodynamics, which says that without external intervention, the disorder of a system can only increase and never decrease. This is because there are so many more ways of being disorderly than there are of being orderly, so that statistically, the waters of chaos continue to rise. We know that we are going to die on a time scale of tens of years. And the cosmologists reliably tell us that the universe itself will die on a time scale of many billions of years, most probably by becoming ever colder and more dilute, till all life must vanish everywhere within it. Does not this fact put in question theologies claim that the universe is now and always a meaningful divine creation. There's certainly no natural expectation that science could offer the hope of a destiny beyond death. Yet the horizontal story that science tells of the unfolding of present processes is not the only tale to tell. There is theology's vertical story of the faithfulness of God, who will not allow anything of good to be lost. This is just the point that Jesus made in his controversy with the Sadducees about whether there is a human destiny beyond death. He pointed them to the fact that at the burning bush, God was declared to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, commenting, the God not of the dead, but of the living. If the patriarchs mattered to God once, as they certainly did, they must matter to the faithful God forever. They were not cast aside at death like broken pots thrown onto a rubbish heap. While there is no natural hope of a destiny beyond death, theologically there is every hope arising from the faithfulness of our Creator. Christians, of course, believe that this hope has been exemplified and guaranteed by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Science of itself can speak neither for nor against this theological conviction. But there remains the question of the credibility of such a hope. Can we make sense of the claim that human beings shall live again after the decay of their bodies? Because I believe that we are intrinsically embodied beings, I believe this hope must take the form of the resurrection of the body and not some form of merely spiritual survival. If such an idea is to be credible, two basic criteria must be satisfied, one of continuity and one of discontinuity. It must really be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob who live again in the kingdom of God, and not just new characters given the old names for old time's sake. This is the criterion of continuity. It requires a carrier of that continuity between this world and the next, which traditionally has been understood as the human soul. I have suggested that the soul is something like an almost infinitely complex information-bearing pattern. This pattern will dissolve with the decay of my body. But it is a coherent hope that God will not allow it to be lost, but will preserve it in the divine memory. That in itself would not be a fully human destiny beyond death, for that would require the re-embodiment of that pattern in some form of environment of God's choosing. In other words, the resurrection of the body. However, there would be no point in making the patriarchs live again simply so that they could die again. So this re-embodiment will have to be in some form of matter different from the matter of this world. And this is the criterion of discontinuity. It seems a wholly coherent possibility that God could create a form of matter so endowed with strong self-organizing principles that it would not be subject to the thermodynamic drift to decay which characterizes the matter of this world. But two further questions then immediately arise. One is, what will be the relation of this matter to present matter? I believe that the one is the redemptive transform of the other, just as Christ's risen and glorified body was the transform of his dead body, hence the empty tomb. Human destiny and cosmic destiny lie together in the Creator's purposes. And he provides a reference to the cosmic Christ of Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 20. More critical is the second question. If the new creation is going to be free from death and futility, why did the Creator bother with the old creation, subject to decay and transience? I believe the answer to lie in a recognition that the Creator's purpose is intrinsically two-step. First, the old creation existing at some distance from the veiled presence of its Creator, so that creatures can be allowed the freedom to be themselves and to make themselves. And then the new creation, drawn freely into ever closer encounter with the unveiled riches of the divine nature. These ideas that I've been trying to sketch are inevitably, to a degree, speculative. In many ways, wait and see is the best strategy for eschatological thinking. But I believe they help us not to waver in our trust in a destiny beyond death, whose guarantee lies ultimately in the faithfulness of God and the resurrection of Christ. Our exploration of the frontier between science and religion has been rather a lightning tour, but I hope it served to show something of the fruitfulness of the dialogue that is taking place. Both scientists and theologians tend to be critical realists, recognizing that there is a truth to be found, but one that is subtle, beyond Enlightenment expectations of unproblematic objectivity. This is because the quest for truth is guided by taking seriously experience which only becomes meaningful when it's interpreted according to a chosen but potentially corrigible point of view. The claim is not to the attainment of final and absolute truth, either in science or theology, but of conclusions that are sufficiently well motivated to justify commitment to belief without giving up the hope of attaining further understanding in due course. Both science and theology know that truth often seems surprising, leading us to conceptions that we would not have been able to form without the nudge of reality. In 1899, no one would have supposed that the wave-particle duality of light was a rational possibility, but it proved to be the case. Early Christianity had to struggle with the deeper duality of the human and divine in Jesus Christ. I see a cousinly relation between my scientific experience and my theological experience. I like to say that I am two-eyed, viewing reality with both the eye of science and the eye of religion. I believe that with this binocular vision, I can see further and deeper than I could with either eye on its own.
Professor Hedley Brooke, I think the applause has been very eloquent. Everyone is extremely grateful for your agreement to read John Polkinghorne's lecture. I was going to say read it, but I think you performed it, although with a charming absence of over-extravagant gesture. It reminded me of Sir Adrian Boult conducting Elgar. And we're very, very grateful indeed. I'm sure, like those who introduced you, everybody here is regretting the reason for Professor Polkinghorne's absence and wishing him a speedy return to health. I can see people here who have a personal reason as well as an intellectual reason for regretting his absence. Coming up to Trinity in 1965 as a very gauche adolescent, I was interested in religion but totally uncommitted. And the cheerful figure of John Polkinghorne was pointed out as some of the evidence why I ought to take the thing much more seriously. He'd just been appointed a reader. By the time I left, he was the professor of mathematical physics. In the reign of the first Queen Elizabeth, masters of colleges in Cambridge, like Whitgift and Parker, rode out of the city to bishoprics and archbishoprics. It's perhaps an eloquent index of the relative decline of the church that in the reign of the second Queen Elizabeth, archbishops are glad to move on to college headships. And in this context, John Polkinghorne's decision to exchange his professorship for a parsonage, that was startling indeed. We've heard a marvelously lucid account of the marches between science and theology in a lecture which also locates the contribution of previous Boyle lecturers. It all underscores our gratitude to those who've generously supported this series, and of course, in the first place, to the partnership between Dr. Michael Byrne and St. Mary Le Bow. We've reviewed the intelligibility of the universe and the proven fruitfulness of mathematical beauty as a guide to successful theory choice. We've looked at anthropic fine-tuning and the wider humane reality. And behind it all is the intuition that physical and mental experience are parts of an interlocking, complementary, created reality. In a very fruitful way, evidenced once again in this lecture, John Polkinghorne brings together scientific acuity with a respect for the biblical witness, with a tentativeness and a humility which is perhaps not characteristic of A.C. Grayling, who wittily describes at least part of John Polkinghorne's material as the superstitious lucubrations of illiterate goat herds living several thousand years ago. I was very glad to hear again Polkinghorne's celebrated illustration of the kettle. You'll remember the kettle is boiling because burning gas heats the water. The kettle is boiling because I want a cup of tea. The questions are distinct. There is no direct read-over, but the answers have to rhyme. And I think when you read the transcript of the lecture, you will see that in his excellent rendition, modesty persuaded Professor Hedley Brooke to omit the laudatory reference to his own lecture. And John Polkinghorne used that lecture to acknowledge the fruitfulness of the dialogue between science and religion over the centuries, despite the mythology that they are enemies. And these lectures are very important because the incompatibility of the scientific and the religious approach to life is, alas, still, a century after it became OTOs, part of the orthodoxy of the lounge bar, the pig and whistle. And not only there, those involved in the preparation of St. Paul's School's confirmation candidates who were presented in the cathedral barely a few weeks ago, they told me that this, the supposed incompatibility of science and religion, was the major stumbling block for some of the brightest of our young people. That's why we've just begun to build a new academy in West London, named in honour of a scientist and an industrialist, William Perkins, and devoted, this is its theme as an academy, devoted to the proposition that science and religion are friends and mutually enriching. What John Polkinghorne said on one occasion of Michael Pogliani is true also of him. He says that Pogliani describes himself as a post-liberal, recognizing that the great Cartesian program of clear and certain ideas, of foundational knowledge, true beyond any possibility of doubt, is unattainable. And yet he's not driven by that to a relativism which simply says, you have your opinions, I have mine. He seeks to find a middle way between the two, greatly aided by his experience of science, where he also recognizes that there is a certain precariousness in human knowledge. Humility, a taste for the middle way, a sense of the unity of all reality. This is the vision that John Polkinghorne has articulated in his remarkable career. And he's stimulated so much, and there's so much more to do, stimulated by his example. In the church, for example, our art, our architecture, our symbolism, our liturgy have hardly begun to reflect the one reality of our marvelous universe, which he has helped to open up for contemporary Christians. Perhaps while regretting his absence tonight, it makes it easier for us, without embarrassment, to express with great enthusiasm our affection, our gratitude, and not only for this evening's lecture, but for John Polkinghorne's lifelong dedication to bilingualism, amphibianism, and to the binocular vision.
With very warm thanks to the Lord Bishop, that concludes this evening's proceedings. I'm happy to say that the 11th Boyle Lecture will take place very early in 2014, and the date will be available on the website very shortly. And we're very delighted to announce that the lecture will be given by the Reverend Professor Alistair McGrath, who is currently Professor of Theology, Ministry and Education at King's College London. We're very grateful for your presence, for your friendship, and for your attention tonight. Thank you so much.